Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. So, what is at the heart of the outgoing President Donald Trump's claims that the election, the that was held last Tuesday on November the 3rd, 2020, was stolen from him? Well, aside from his big ego and his pride, also his desire to pander to that radical right wing segment of the Republican Party, and generally speaking of the US electorate, who strongly, even passionately, or should I say idolatrously, support him. And also alleged election irregularities, although a growing number of Republicans, including one former governor, John Kasich, and according to reports, even Trump's current wife, Melania Trump, and even his son in law, Jared Kushner, and a growing number of his assistants in the White House. Um, at least one Republican US Senator, Mitch Romney, by the way, the party's presidential candidate in 2012, and then even a former president, George W. Bush, have directly or indirectly urged Donald Trump to concede. And a growing number of Republicans have already congratulated President elect Joe Biden. So here are five election irregularity claims, none of which he has been able to prove true. So let's go to in the United States. Yeah, on November the 8th, 2020. Written by, or actually on November the 9th, 2020, but originally probably in an unedited form on November the 8th already, by David A. Fahrenthold, Elise Viebeck, Emma Brown, and Rosalind S. Helderman. Republicans have made claims of election irregularities in 5 states where President-elect Joe Biden leads in the vote count, alleging in lawsuits and public statements that election officials did not follow proper procedures while counting ballots in last Tuesday's election. So far, they have won none of those 5 lawsuits. Since the election, that a broad conspiracy of misdeeds apparently committed in both Republican and Democratic states had cost him the election. He tweeted on Saturday, November the 7th, 2020, "I won the election, got 71 million legal votes after returning to the White House from his Virginia golf course. Bad things happened which our observers were not allowed to see. Trump's campaign has encouraged donors to contribute to a legal defense fund so he can fight the cases in court." I would add probably one of the reasons is that he needs quite a war chest to fight the legal cases that will await him, for the mispronunciation, that will await him come January the 20th, 2021, because he has a string of allegations that he has improperly used his position as a business tycoon by grossly underpaying his taxes, by women, tens of women, including incidentally at least one Finnish, I think, former beauty pageant or at least contestant, that he would have sexually harassed or even assaulted them. So he will be a busy former president, but not in a positive sense. He will have to fight these allegations, and then, in the worst case scenario, he might even be forced into a trial. Hopefully, that will not happen, but that is nevertheless one of the negative scenarios for him as a former president, because he will no longer have legal immunity afforded to him by the presidency come January the 20th, 2021, when he will constitutionally have to yield power to his successor elect, Joe Biden. The reality is that he received under 71 million popular votes, while, according to the latest count, Joe Biden received over 74 or even over 75 million votes. And he's simply refusing to admit the facts. Which is very sad. So, according to the Washington Post's website, okay, yes, it's true that Trump actually won over 71 million votes, but Biden won over 75 million votes. So, according to the Washington Post's website, Biden won, rounded off to the nearest full thousand votes, 75,552,000 votes, or 50.6%, while Trump received approximately 71,190,000 votes, or 47.7%. In other words, Biden won according to the yet incomplete results, and he might still even increase his margin because many more of his supporters voted in advance than of Trump supporters. He won over 4.3 million more votes than did Trump. And since the vote counting is becoming steadily more punctual, more accurate, and since the recounting methods are becoming steadily more punctual and accurate, it's increasingly difficult for the losers to be able to overturn the results in court. There would have to be massive vote fraud, like actually stolen and or tampered ballot boxes. So far, none of the respectable, believable news outlets have provided any proven information of anything like that. This is 2020, not, for example, 1960. In that year's presidential elections, which were closely contested, and where indeed it is probable that the official winner won, at least partly because of vote fraud, the late and later assassinated Senator and then later President John Kennedy narrowly and controversially won the Republican presidential candidate, then Vice President Richard Nixon. However, Nixon did the respectable thing. Even though he doubted that the election results were genuine, he calculated that the cost of his publicly challenging them and risking the possibility that even after a recount he would still lose was too high. So by conceding the election, which he did quietly by congratulating Senator Kennedy in a telegram, he saved himself for a further presidential campaign, and actually he was still the Republican Party's presidential candidate twice, in 1968 and 1972, and won both elections. Then fast forward to 1976, when there were some election fraud and irregularity allegations that there supposedly would have been in, I think, Wisconsin, maybe also another state, apparently, according to rumors cited by some of President Gerald Ford's advisors, that there would have been illegal on-the-spot registering of voters, and that on the East Coast, some Democrats would have illegally voted twice. So first in one state, then in another. What did the defeated lost? I will not be a party to a recount or a lawsuit of any kind. The case was closed. No wonder 2.5 months later, on January the 20th, 1977, his successor, Jimmy Carter, apparently genuinely thanked him for all that Ford had done to heal the United States. Visibly moved, Ford warmly shook Carter's hand and probably said some kind words to him. Expect none of that from Donald Trump, although Joe Biden is enough of a gentleman to try to sound a note of reconciliation in his future inaugural address. But I digress. But in the lawsuits themselves, even Trump's campaign and allies do not allege widespread fraud or an election changing conspiracy. Instead, GOP groups have largely focused on smaller bore complaints in an effort to delay the counting of ballots or claims that would affect a small fraction of votes at best. And even then, they have largely lost in court. What is the reason? Judges have said the Republicans did not provide evidence to back up their assertions, just speculation, rumors, or hearsay. Or in one case, hearsay written on a sticky note. And then fast forward to 2000. Then it took 5 weeks for the loser of the election finally to admit his loss. He was then Vice President of the United States, turned after his political career into a spokesman for the environmentalist movement, Al Gore. So eventually, he decided that it was not worth the effort to try to continue the recounting of votes in Florida, which he was losing by a razor-thin margin to the Texas Governor George W. Bush. So he did the honorable thing, and Bush also thanked him for a vigorously fought campaign that was concluded with grace or something like that. The result has been a flurry of filing Trump has cited as a reason to avoid conceding defeat, but so far have done nothing to prevent the defeat itself. Protesters, according to a photograph taken by Bonnie Jo Mount for the Washington Post, rally outside the Pennsylvania Convention Center in Philadelphia, where election votes were being counted on Thursday, so November the 5th, 2020. So in Pennsylvania, which is a mid-Atlantic state in northeastern United States, as absentee ballots helped Biden overtake Trump in Pennsylvania last week, Republicans sought to stop Philadelphia officials from counting them. Their argument, which was false, that supposedly Republican observers had been barred from the rooms where the votes were being counted. In fact, there were Republican observers in those rooms. Trump had a non-zero number of people in the room, one of his attorneys conceded in federal court on Thursday evening. I'm sorry, then what's your problem? And very appropriately asked U.S. District Judge Paul S. Diamond, who denied the request to halt the count. Trump's team saw a few small victories in Pennsylvania, though none seems likely to come close to affecting the race's outcome. The campaign won an order to move observers closer to the counting machines in Philadelphia. And it succeeded in getting Supreme Court Justice and appointee of the former President George W. Bush, who incidentally has already congratulated Joe Biden on his victory, Samuel A. Alito Jr. to issue an order that election officials must separate ballots that arrived after Election Day but before Friday evening, a step that counties have already taken. So this is quite superfluous, to say the least, or redundant. So probably the main reason is to pander to the hardcore Trump supporters so that they will be placated in their great grief at their candidates, or rather idols' loss. Under an earlier ruling by the state Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, election officials may tally those ballots which are a tiny fraction of the overall vote, but state officials have ordered them to be kept segregated or separated in case of further legal challenges. Elsewhere in Pennsylvania, Republicans sued to stop local election officials from releasing the names of voters whose absentee ballots had been rejected for errors such as a lack of signature. Local counties release the names so voters can fix the flaws in their ballots. These suits have not succeeded either. In Northampton County, Pennsylvania, for instance, a judge wrote that the local Republican Party needed to prove why it would be injured if voters had a chance to correct their ballots. As a result, its request for an injunction must fail, wrote Judge Michael J. Coury Jr. On Saturday, Trump's lawyer Rudolph W. Giuliani, and by the way, former mayor of the New York City, said that the campaign was preparing to file another lawsuit on Monday, alleging wrongdoing on a grand scale in Pennsylvania. Many cases are going to be filed, some big, some small. This is going to be eventually a big case, Giuliani said. In Michigan, Biden trailed on election night, but then, as in other Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Minnesota, surged back to overtake Trump as thousands of absentee ballots were counted. In two lawsuits, Republicans alleged that there was impropriety in those ballot counts. They lost both times. And for the same reason, Republicans could not provide evidence of wrongdoing. And the more liberal, moderate Republicans actually would prefer the party's right-wing zealots to stop this waste of time and human resources, financial resources, and waste of the public faith in the election results. And they predict correctly that in the long run, or at least in the short run, the Republican Party is going to suffer because so many Americans, especially of the more moderate American voters, including the floating ones who have no firm party allegiances, are going to see the Republican Party and especially its hardcore right-wing members as sore losers, and rightly so. And of course, it would be the same thing if the Democrats were doing that, and especially the hardcore left-wing Democrats. But I'm quite sure that if the election results had gone the opposite way, Joe Biden would have done the decent thing. He would have acknowledged his defeat and would have congratulated Trump on his victory and would have urged his followers to accept the result as well. Trump has done none of the above so far. He's too proud to do so, at least so far. Of course, we should hope and pray that God will melt his heart into repentance in the next few days or weeks. In one case, Republicans said that Republican election observers in Detroit, Michigan, were being excluded when city officials fixed or cured, in quotation marks, ballots that their machines couldn't read. In these cases, which might be caused by a stray mark or coffee stain, officials can make a duplicate ballot with the same votes and run that one instead. Republicans said they had information and belief that this curing process had been done repeatedly without a Republican official there to observe it. They asked a judge to delay certifying Detroit's results. The judge refused. He said the Republican Party's evidence of misconduct was mere speculation. Wrote Judge Timothy M. Kenney, the city of Detroit should not be harmed when there is no evidence to support accusations of vote fraud. In another lawsuit, Trump's presidential campaign asked a judge to stop all processing of absentee ballots in Michigan. In that case, a Republican election observer said that she had been given a sticky note by an unnamed poll worker alleging that late arriving ballots were being counted improperly. But she couldn't provide the poll worker's name or any other proof. And of course, such a case will be dismissed in court. Without any corroborating evidence, obviously. A judge rejected that, saying that the Republican Party's evidence was inadmissible as hearsay. The judge also said that because Trump's campaign had waited until late afternoon on Wednesday to file, its suit was moot or debatable. By the time this action was filed, the votes had already or had largely been counted, and the counting is now complete, Judge Cynthia Diane Stevens wrote on Friday. Meanwhile, Republican National Committee Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel raised another series of claims during a news conference on Friday in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, alleging that election workers in Detroit were told to backdate certain ballots. Detroit officials denied the accusation. McDaniel acknowledged that her allegations had not been fully vetted and said the information had been shared with federal prosecutors. A Justice Department official said the information McDaniel provided has been referred to the FBI. It was unclear what, if any, action the agency planned to take. An FBI spokeswoman in Detroit referred a reporter to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which declined to comment. McDaniel also asserted that 2,000 Republican ballots in Rochester Hills, Michigan, had been given to Democrats due to a clerical error. Tina Barton, the Republican city clerk of Rochester Hills, said in a video posted on Twitter that McDaniel was referring to an isolated mistake that was quickly rectified, and called her allegation categorically false. And note, not a Democrat, but a fellow Republican. As a Republican, I'm disturbed that this is intentionally being mischaracterized to undermine the election process, she said in the video. I applaud that Republican. She was talking common sense. He said, generally speaking, as a succinct summary of these lawsuits. So intentionally being mischaracterized to undermine the election process. Like this was much more characteristic of the 18th and especially 19th centuries. In what countries? Britain and certain British colonies like Canada. Why? Well, first of all, the right to vote was until the late 19th century, when electoral reform started to expand the right to vote, largely limited to the wealthy men. Yes, the first Reform Act or Electoral Reform Act in Britain in 1832 did expand the right to vote to a number of middle-class men. Then the Second Reform Act in 1867 largely enfranchised the urban male workers. And then the 1885 Reform Act largely enfranchised the male agricultural workers. But even after the last one of these so-called Great Reform Acts, between 40 and 50% of the adult vote, because they either didn't pay regular taxes or didn't pay high enough rents, or then later, already in the early 19th century, before the 1918 enfranchisement of all British men, saved from, for example, those in mental asylums or those without a proven residence, aged 21 and above, who were citizens, those who frequently changed their hometown, for example, in search for work, or because they had been hired in another city or town, were denied the right to vote. And in Canada, where I also lived in my distant youth in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was quite typical, for example, in the province of Ontario in the late 19th century, for defeated parliamentary or legislative candidates to go to court if they were dissatisfied with their loss. But we have to remember, this was over 100 years ago, when the electorate was much smaller, when election fraud was rife, and when until the early 1870s there was no secret ballot, even in the federal elections of Canada, which of course meant that voter intimidation and even open bribery of voters were common. And then still in the early 20th century, at least one European country that was not a communist dictatorship, but rather an authoritarian conservative dictatorship, Hungary, had open voting in its rural towns and small cities, which of course helped the ruling party of the regent or temporary head of state, Admiral Miklos Horthy, to intimidate the opposition voters. So this is like much more typical of emerging democracies or authoritarian or hybrid regimes than of a country which claims to be and has claimed to be for a long time the world's leading democracy. And it's actually shameful that the country's democratic resources are being used that way. All Donald Trump would have to do would be to quietly concede the election on Twitter or by a telegram. The election is over and we lost. Let's stop all lawsuits, period. That would be all that he would have to do, but maybe he fears a backlash from his hardest core supporters, both right wing and far right ones. In an interview, Ms. Barton said that there was a technical issue that temporarily created duplicate results when mail ballots were scanned, but it was immediately fixed. She also said that she learned of the Republican National Committee chairwoman's claim only when a reporter called her for comment. Commented Ms. Barton, I have spent 15 years building my reputation of being a good election official, not only a good one, but a great one. And to have someone make a statement that we committed fraud of some kind, that 2,000 ballots were found, I couldn't stand by and not respond. And rightly so. Georgia. In Georgia, Trump's campaign filed a lawsuit the day after the election, so November the 4th, 2020, focused narrowly on absentee ballots in Chatham County, home to Savannah. The campaign asked that any absentee ballots arriving after the polls closed on Tuesday be set aside. For most voters, Georgia requires ballots to arrive before the end of Election Day, though there is an exception for military votes and overseas voters. So those who are on active duty in the Army, U.S. Army, and then those eligible U.S. citizens who have a right to vote in Georgia who live outside the United States, and especially on other continents. The Trump campaign cited an affidavit from a poll worker who said he thought he might have seen late arriving ballots improperly mingled with votes with ones cast on time. Even if that was true, it was not an election-changing problem. The allegation dealt with a small number of ballots in a single county. Georgia Democrats filed 2 affidavits from other poll workers who said they observed no such intermingling. A Georgia judge dismissed Trump's suit in one day, writing that there was no evidence the county elections board had failed to comply with the law. Then from Arizona. In Arizona, the Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee filed suit in state court on Saturday, alleging that some voters were told by poll workers to push a button on a tabulating machine to cast their ballot, even after machine tabulators had detected an overvote. That is, the machine detected the possibility that the person had voted for 2 candidates. Under state rules, they said voters are supposed to be allowed to cancel such ballots and try again, because sometimes stray ink marks or smudges can cause the tabulator to improperly assess an overvote. The campaign asked a judge to order a manual review of such ballots and to bar the certification of the Arizona vote until it is complete. Trump supporters spent much of the week alleging that the tabulators were thrown off by the use of Sharpie pens and therefore disqualified large numbers of votes. State officials have insisted Sharpie pens are in fact the best writing instrument to use with the machines because of their fast dry ink, and they do not cause problems. And besides, already since the 1980s, if not even since the 1960s, Arizona has been a heavily Republican state. So most of those election officials, if they have a party affiliation at all, are likely Republicans. Voters who filed an earlier suit alleging Sharpie caused ballot issues have dropped that one and are intervening in the new case filed by the Trump campaign, according to lawyer Alexandra Kolodin. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, incidentally a Democrat, said the new suit was a repackaging of that matter and merely an attempt to delay the count. And it's inconsistent to insist that every vote be counted and then to try to delay the vote count in at least one state. It shows how desperate certain Republicans, especially hardcore right-wing Republicans, have become. Nevada. In Nevada, which is a closely balanced state in many presidential elections, especially, so neither the Democrats nor the Republicans has a clear advantage in many presidential elections. 2 days after the election, a group of Trump allies claimed that thousands of people had voted illegally in Clark County, home to Las Vegas. That is unacceptable, and it's giving legal people a sense that the system is corrupt, said Richard Grenell, Trump's former acting director of national intelligence. Neither the Trump campaign nor the Republican Party were named plaintiffs in the federal lawsuit that was eventually filed by Republicans, which presented no evidence that thousands of people had voted improperly. By then, the allegation had been whittled down drastically. Instead of 10,000 cases, Trump's allies presented one, a woman named Jill Stock, who said she was denied the right to vote in person because her mail ballot had been stolen and filled out by someone else. But in fact, Ms. Stock's story was more complicated. Election officials said they had indeed received a mail ballot from her, but the signature matched her own. They had offered her a chance to cancel that mail ballot and vote again if she would sign an affidavit saying the mail ballot had been stolen. She did not. The Trump allies wanted U.S. District Judge Andrew Gordon to order a ban on the use of a machine for verifying signatures, a move that would have slowed down an already slow count. He did not. Instead, Gordon told the plaintiffs to return to court if they found more evidence to back their claims. Beyond that lawsuit, Republican officials also alleged that over 3,000 people voted in Nevada despite not living in the state. Lawyers for the Trump campaign sent a letter on Thursday to U.S. Attorney General William P. Barr, that is the United States Federal Justice Minister, alleging that criminal voter fraud in the state of Nevada and claiming to have identified 3,062 people who voted improperly. They enclosed a list of addresses of voters who they said had moved out of state. Information they said came from cross-checking voter data with the National Change of Address database. At a news conference on Sunday before a crowd of cheering supporters in Las Vegas, no wonder, Trump campaign officials went further, claiming that as many as 9,000 non-residents wrongly voted and that the Clark County election system was riddled with other fraud without offering credible evidence. Local election officials have stressed that Nevada law allows some people to vote while living out of state: students, military personnel, and military spouses, and hardly all of them, or a great majority of them, are Democrats or even quite regular Democratic voters, since Nevada is a closely balanced state politically. You don't have to live here in order to be eligible to vote here, Joe Gloria, the Clark County Registrar of Voters, told reporters last week. The addresses of Amy Rose and her husband, an Air Force service member, are on the Trump campaign's list of out-of-state voters. Rose and her husband currently live in Davis, California, where she works for a veterans support organization, and her husband is pursuing a doctorate, doing Air Force-funded research in aerospace engineering. Rose said, "It's really appalling to be used as pawns to undermine confidence in the election results. We both take our duties as citizens seriously. It was quite shocking to see our integrity challenged without any basis in fact." In a statement, the Nevada Republican Party said it has no intention of invalidating any legal voter. So what's the problem anymore then? A Justice Department official said the department was looking into the allegations but declined to provide more detail. Michelle Yee-Hee Lee, Matt Zapotosky, Aaron Schaffer, and Andrew Tran in Washington, Tom Hamburger in Detroit, and Hannah Knowles in Phoenix contributed to this report, updated on November the 8th, 2020. So in my opinion, it's shameful that in a major democracy, advanced democracy like the United States, the election officials and justice officials time is being wasted for such baseless claims, or at even at best doubtful claims?